Hey friends, it's Joel Richardson, and we have kind of a special program today. I've got my good friend here, Tim Mahoney. Most of you probably actually know who Tim is, but I'm sure there's some who don't. Tim has been working on multiple film projects over the past, really the past decade or so, that revolve around the issue of Mount Sinai. And so because of that, I know many of you have been following my adventures the past few years in Saudi Arabia, my personal firm conviction regarding the mountain called Jebel al-Lawz as being the real Mount Sinai. Tim has been exploring this issue of Mount Sinai from multiple different angles. Without any further ado, I'm actually just going to let you kind of introduce yourself, Tim. Tell everyone, just assume that some of those jumping on here are not familiar with you. Just give our listeners a bit of a sort of overview of what you've been up to the past, as I said, decade or so.
Yeah, actually, Joel, thank you for having me, and I'm really happy to share this because I started actually in about 2000, the year 2000, when I first heard about this information, and it eventually led me to develop the first project. It wasn't called Patterns of Evidence at that time. It was just, we're looking for the sea crossing, and we'd heard about Mount Sinai being in Saudi Arabia. And in 2002, I actually went to Egypt with Dr. Leonard Moeller, and he is a Swedish research scientist, and we spent about 3 weeks there. We went to some, I think, really significant places. We were hearing about, evidences that people were talking about, and to me, it was startling that there could possibly be some type of physical evidence left. And that 2002 trip took another 12 years for me to actually make the first film, which was called Patterns of Evidence, the Exodus, and it was in over 650 theaters nationwide. And since then, I've made other films that are following in the sequence. I had no idea that it would take this long to do this, but then I followed up with the Moses controversy, which had to do with inscriptions and the Proto-Sinaitic writing, where Egyptian hieroglyphs were modified. It became the world's first alphabet. And our films are looking at, is there evidence for the Israelites? As you know, many scholars say, oh, we can't find any evidence for these biblical things, and so the Bible is a myth. And what we're saying, and what I've looked at, is our films have had multiple points of view. And I hear from people that say there's no evidence, and then I ask them, well, why do you say that? And what evidence you have besides lack of evidence, and so that's kind of what led to the making of this film. And what we found, it's the scientific approach, is that if you look for a pattern, and God works in patterns, as we see, he does things, he repeats things. And the question of the pattern for us was, can we find evidence of these events? And we used the Bible as the criteria. And so the reason we're talking today is we've got a new movie coming out, which is dealing with Mount Sinai. It's called Patterns of Evidence, Journey to Mount Sinai. And in that, we take the same Patterns of Evidence approach, where we actually have a PDF that you can download. If you go to patternsofevidence.com, you can download this PDF. I think it's about 8 pages, and it has the biblical investigation criteria from the Bible. It also has a map with the 6 mountains that we're going to be looking at and the campsites along the bottom. And then it has something very, very unique that we've never done before, and it's called the Mount Sinai scorecard. And what we're going to do is we're going to basically, Joel, have you ever gone bowling?
I have.
Are you a strike, a spare, or a gutter ball guy?
I'm a nightmare. I'm a little bit of all of the above.
Yeah, me too. It's like I used to be a good bowler, but I just went out recently, and man, I actually threw a few gutter balls. But this basically has, when you watch the movie, we actually are going to look for different pieces of the pattern from the scripture. And one of them is Journey to the Mountain. What was the journey that the Israelites took? So we're going to look at all these different mountains. The first film is looking at 3 mountains. It's the traditional Mount Sinai, a mountain called Jebel Sinai in the Sinai Peninsula, and then Hashem El Tarif, which is a little bit closer to Israel. It's still in the Sinai Peninsula. We're going to look at those 3 Sinai Peninsula mountains. And then we're going to basically have where's Midian is another part of this. The backside of the wilderness. Moses was said to have left Jethro's home and went to the backside of the wilderness. So what does that mean biblically? Does it mean to the east, to the west? What does that mean? And then we're going to look for attributes. And as you know, you've gone to look at Jebel Laws, and you're looking at the attributes of the mountain. Is there an area that's large enough for the Israelites to camp, a plain? Is there water? Was there a water source there? Is there a stream? That the Bible says there was a stream at the mountain. And is there a cave where Elijah was? And so these are attributes of that mountain. And then the question is are there any artifacts? Because it says that Moses built an altar and there were pillars there, 12 pillars. There's room for this large encampment. Are there any remains of encampment? A golden calf worship. Do we see anything connected to that? Are there inscriptions? And can anyone understand what they say? And what other types of evidences could there be? Such as there was a number of people that were killed. And so these types of evidences is things that we're looking for. And then there's bonus material, Kadesh Barnea and beyond Yam Suf. Now, there are many different ways to try to tackle, what is the way to hone in. And I know when I heard you in the past, when people talked about Jebel Laws, you weren't interested, but you thought you'd check it out. So what happened to you?
So in my case, and I think I shared some of this with you when we were sort of interviewing for the movie. And so for those who aren't aware, I actually feature, I guess, in the second film?
You're actually in the first film. You're in this movie. Yep. And you will be in the second movie.
Yeah. Now, folks may not recognize me because I actually have a very clean shaven face, which is pretty rare for me, but regardless. So, yeah, I mean, in my case, I'm largely focused the past, as you have, the past 20 years on missions, teaching, talking about eschatology, the return of Jesus and this sort of thing. So I go to a lot of these prophecy conferences. And as a teacher, people would often approach me and show me pictures of Jebel Laws, and they'd say, what do you think about this? And I would always answer the same way. I'd say, I really don't know. This is not my purview. It's not my specialty. I'm not an archaeology guy. I'm a missions guy. I'm an eschatology guy. But every time it was a very unusual experience that someone showed me pictures of this, something in me would just rise up. And I would say, Lord, I asked that you would get me into Saudi Arabia. Of course, Saudi Arabia, up until just a couple of years ago, was closed to any type of tourism. And so it was the third or fourth time that I heard about someone who had gone there, showed me some pictures. And I texted him and I said, can you get me into Saudi Arabia? And he immediately responded, said, absolutely. I can get you work visa, legitimate work visa, to do some photography, some promotional work. And so I was incredibly excited. And so that was now, I guess it's pushing 4.5 years ago. Maybe I've lost track of time with COVID. It's been a few years ago now. I had a chance to go for the first time. And I am a very thorough researcher. It's one of my strengths. So in the lead up, in the few months leading up to going to Jebel Laws, I devoured. I read all of the positive literature, that all of the positive things that have been written in favor of Jebel Laws being the real Mount Sinai, but I also read all of the critical literature. And there is quite a bit of critical literature about it. In fact, I would say of all the different candidates out there, it's probably mocked more than any others. There's been the most controversy that has swirled around this mountain. So in any case, looking at the positives, looking at the negatives, I came away from this saying, this is by far, just on paper, it has the most evidence, because it clearly was, of all the different candidates out there, it clearly is the best candidate to be the mountain that the Jews of the first century believed was the real Mount Sinai. And so with that as the foundation, I went, and in my opinion, the mountain sells itself. Everything I saw fulfilled the biblical criteria, and then point after point after point, it all just fell into place. And then so coming back, I continued to do much more research into a lot of historical source documents and some of the earlier references to Mount Sinai and this type of thing. Looked at the strengths and the weaknesses of the traditional Mount Sinai, as well as a bit into Har Karkum, which is another candidate. And I came away just saying this, and I hate sensationalism, Tim, and I appreciate your approach, a very non-sensational approach. I'll actually say this. I believe that once the academy catches on to this, once the larger mainstream world of archaeology sees this and gets a hold of it, I genuinely think it's going to be the single greatest, most significant biblical archaeological site really in history, or we'll say discovery in history. I don't like to use the word discovered because it's never been lost. But when you look at, and forgive me for talking so much here, but when you look at just the world of archaeology, for the most part, mainstream archaeologists will say, really, there's nothing much older than the time of David in terms of really validating the biblical narrative. They go, yeah, we'll say history aligns back to the time of David. You know, they just recently found this little piece of metal which may push things back to the time of Joshua. But the golden chalice that everyone's looking for is to validate the Exodus. And the unbelief throughout much of the academic community regarding the Exodus is tremendous. And so if indeed the real Mount Sinai is just sitting there for everyone, just to go up, if all the evidence is sitting there, this is huge. And so for me, it's more than just an issue of archaeology. It really is. I think the Lord himself has a testimony. And I think that the testimony that he has is even providentially timed for this moment in history. I really think that this is all going according to the Lord's sovereign plan. So I'm obviously incredibly excited, and I'm just honored to be able to be part of your films and so forth. And so, and I'm really grateful for all of the incredibly hard work that you put into this, Tim, to educate people, to walk people systematically through so many of these really complicated issues, to simplify it, and just to make it available to the popular believing and unbelieving world.
Well, I appreciate those words, and yeah, it is a long process. In 2003, I actually got permission to go into Saudi Arabia, and I actually went to Jebel Alaz. I filmed amazing footage. I worked at it and everything, but then things got more complicated when we were there. As you know, they can get complicated with people that do not want you to be there. And even though we had permission, and then I never got my footage. I mean, the footage was gone, so that was. But I did take photographs. But so that whole journey to Mount Sinai for me, literally now, is 2 decades. In fact, the second film will come out 20 years after I went to Saudi Arabia. And so when you think about that, there's this making these films, it's a marathon in some cases. And what we're wanting people to do is to basically, I'm going to use the term vote for the Bible. When the theaters, this film, Journey to Mount Sinai, Patterns of Evidence, Journey to Mount Sinai, is going to be in over 800 theaters. And when people, attend it, the reason why it's important to attend is because it sends a signal that these kinds of biblical films are appreciated, that there's an audience for them. And yeah, we still want people to buy it because there's so much information in these films that you're going to want to keep. You're going to have it. You want to share it with your family, with your friends. And my concern always has been is that as more and more information gets put on the internet, it's very possible that that information gets shut off. It's not permitted. So it's important for you to have your own copies of films. not to think, oh, I'll just stream it when I want it or whatever. That might not be the case. These films are testifying that there's a pattern of evidence. The first film was the Exodus. Then we did Moses' Controversy about the writing. Red Sea Miracle 1 and 2 were the films that we made before this, which is looking at the journey from Exodus all the way to the sea crossing. And then it raises the question of miracles. Can God perform miracles that are large, or is he limited to the laws of nature? Is it just naturalistic methods for miracles? So Journey to Mount Sinai is like, I think it's an important film for people to vote for by going to the theaters, and it's a Fathom event. And if they go to patternsofevidence.com, they can see the trailer. In fact, hey, why don't we just show a movie trailer right now?
Excellent. Yeah, let's do it.
For the last 50 years, Exodus explorers have been searching for the true location of Mount Sinai. The Bible tells us that Moses and the Israelites were led there by a pillar of fire and cloud. I'm Timothy Mahoney, an investigative filmmaker. And I'm looking for a pattern of evidence matching one of the most important events recorded in the Bible. The mountainous location where God came down to meet Moses and the Israelites. Exodus explorers are now claiming they found physical evidence for this biblical event. But there is a controversy, because this evidence is not where tradition places the mountain. How will we know which is the true location? It was recorded that after the Israelites crossed the sea, they camped numerous times on their way to Mount Sinai. Now, for the first time, Patterns of Evidence will investigate the journey of Moses and the Israelites. What route did they take, and what evidence still remains today? Join me on this amazing and inspiring investigation. Patterns of Evidence, Journey to Mount Sinai.
So this looks like it's going to be really fantastic. So now let me ask you, it's Journey to Mount Sinai. You've got 1 and 2. Do I have that right?
Correct. Yep.
And then what is your timing in terms of the release of the 2 films?
Well, October 17th and 18th, it's going to be in theaters nationwide. And the next film, we're still working on raising the money for that. But we've got it all shot pretty much. I'm in the studio here. I still need to, film some of the on-camera linking, and but a lot of the material has been filmed already, and we're hoping to get that released, in the early part of this coming year. We don't want it to be too long so that people can have it, because the scorecard is going to basically, you get this scorecard out, you're going to basically be able to, in the first film, keep track of the first 3 mountains. I use the analogy of when you go to the grocery store, you're going there, your wife wants you to get something, and it never fails. I walk through the aisles of a grocery store and I start seeing things that I go, oh, dark chocolate, I need that. Then there's something else, and before you know it, my arms are just full of items that I wasn't expecting. We started realizing that when I make these films, we have our company's called Thinking Man Films, so there's a lot to think about. But what the scorecard and the interactive part of this now is allowing you to basically take some of the things so you don't get confused. You can make a decision as you watch the movie, because I'm going to pause and say, okay, here's the evidence for campsites and wildernesses. What do you think about this mountain? Were you convinced? You give it a yes, a maybe, or no. And that will then free you up, and you can keep track of that on your scorecard as you're watching the film. And I think that it's going to be, at the end of the day, there's only one location that could happen. So you just have to basically say, okay, which one is it? Mm-hmm. And the reason why I think that, people, I don't know if you've ever been asked, well, why is it important that the Exodus is true? Or why do you care that there's physical evidence? It's because, in my particular case, is that God is telling us that he's acting in history. And because of the event at Mount Sinai, the law was given, and Israel became a nation. So the nation of Israel had a beginning right there, and there was a covenant that was made. And those covenants were really, you can actually, I already know, because I know what the future investigations are going to be, but those covenants, you can track those throughout history. It says that if the Israelites were faithful to God, that he would bless them, and if they weren't, that they would be destroyed as a nation, they would be cast out of the nation, they'd be persecuted, but in the future they would return.
Mhm.
And that is I believe, a law that God made between himself and the people of Israel. And that has happened twice with the Babylonian destruction of the temple, and then with the Roman destruction. And so, as you know, there's a lot that we need to be conscious of. And so journeying to Mount Sinai, as I'm working through the Bible, I'm going to continue, by God's grace, make these films that will give a pattern of evidence showing that God is acting in history, and what he said he did, he did. And let's see what else he said he did. And what does that mean for us today? How do we live?
Exactly.
And there's going to be a panel discussion at the end of the film, which will be really, really good, because it's going to ask the question about, well, what does this mean for us personally? And we've got a Protestant minister, a Catholic theologian, and a Messianic Jewish person, Tom Berkowitz, and he's in on it. I'm trying to think of all Jeff Cavins and Dr. Mark Henry. They're going to be all on this panel discussion, and it turned out really, really well. So it's going to be a great, great event, and that's why we want people to vote for it and show their support for biblical films.
Excellent, excellent. Just curiously, we haven't talked. Have you read or have you looked at my book, Sinai to Zion?
No, but now that I know that you've got that book, I'm really interested in that. Yeah.
So for what it's worth, so I have two books. One is just called Mount Sinai in Arabia. That's where I just try to simplify the primary evidences for Jebel Allah's. But Sinai to Zion, for what it's worth, is where I lay out the case that the concept of the return of Jesus, or let me rephrase that, the biblical narrative concerning the return of Jesus is entirely framed using all of the Exodus imagery. So if you're to understand the biblical narrative in terms of the way that it's framed as a story, most Christians, for the most part, they look at the Exodus as sort of one in a series of any number of very important Old Testament stories. You know, they go, well, you got the story of David and Goliath, and Samson and Delilah, and Moses and the Exodus. You know, they don't realize that from a biblical perspective, from the Lord's perspective, in terms of the way the story has been written, it is the towering mountain, the foundation for everything. The entire Bible, you know, the prophets are pointing back to Mount Sinai. Remember, remember, remember. Do not forget the mighty things that God did when he led you out of Egypt with the Exodus, which culminates with the grand theophany of God coming down on the mountain. And so then you have a handful of key passages. The foundational one, of course, is Deuteronomy 33, the blessing of Moses, the last words of Moses before he dies. And when you look at this sort of prophetic declaration that Moses makes, he describes Yahweh, God Almighty, as marching, as coming from heaven. First of all, he comes from heaven. And then he is portrayed as shining like the sun, like the morning sun. He's dawning over these massive mountains to the south of Israel. He's dawning from Sinai. He's radiating over Mount Paran. And he's portrayed in anthropomorphic form. He's marching before his people. It describes lightning or fire shooting out of his hands. He's saving his people. So when you take all of these motifs, God comes from heaven in blazing fire to save his people, to execute judgment or vengeance against his enemies and the enemies of his people. He comes back in anthropomorphic form with armies of myriads of holy ones. And that's really the first place that that reference is mentioned in the Bible. All of that imagery is then adopted and embraced by not only Jesus, Peter, Paul, and John, but even the prophets themselves. And so in passages like Habakkuk chapter 3, Psalm 68, Judges chapter 5, Isaiah 63, you have these numerous references, very poetic, prophetic, but yet literal, of God coming from heaven, again, in anthropomorphic form, to save his people at the end of the age, to execute vengeance against his enemies with armies of angels in blazing fire. And all of that imagery is then appropriated. Jesus applies it to his own return. And so that grand theophany at Mount Sinai, it's intended to be understood throughout the biblical narrative. It's intended to be understood as a faint foreshadow, as a dress rehearsal for what is to come. And so you go, why does the Lord want us to believe all of the mighty, outlandish, ridiculous things that he did in the beginning? It's so that we'll have faith and confidence in this other outlandish, incredible thing that he's about to do. And that is a big part of why I believe the timing of this all is very profound. I believe that, when you look at the Exodus, again, the overwhelming statement the Lord says is, he says, remember, don't forget, remember all these things that I did. And for the most part, most of the Jewish world, most of the Christian world has forgotten. And so I believe the Lord is about to remind the world and say, remember this. It's just, here's the evidence just sitting there out in the desert for the whole world to see and observe. And he's going to, as he reminds the world, he's going to say, and don't forget what is about to come. So I think there's profound foundational reasons to believe the story, but I believe there's even greater eschatological future reasons why this is important. So we've never actually talked about that. Forgive me for preaching. That's what I do. But I'm really jazzed up about it, and I really think you're a critical part of this whole thing that's unfolding.
Well, making this film for 12 years was very, very difficult because I had a regular business. I mean, what's happened to me was I was making commercials and doing other things. Of course, I always wanted to make these types of films. But after I came back from Egypt, and then I went to Saudi, and then I went, to Israel, I was praying and asking God, well, what in the world is this about? Because it just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And after weeks and probably maybe several months, I felt in my heart that what God was saying to me is, I'm making a film. These films are about remembrance and forewarning.
Mm-hmm.
That's the word that I have. And until you had brought that up, I hadn't thought about that for a while, probably for several years. Mm-hmm. But remembrance and forewarning is what these films are pointing to. And the larger body of work, I think, is that as the world starts to become much more unstable, I think it's important for people of faith, as well as those prodigals that are out there, to basically start to get a sense of, well, what's the foundation here? What's the granite that I can stand on when the rest of this thing is shaking here? And what God is going to, I think, do is he's showing us that his word is true. And the other part of this too, that I didn't know, because I started reading in Revelations, is that the plagues of the Exodus, the very types of the plagues of the Exodus are repeated in the end times. Yep. And so what we have then is the plagues, then Israel goes as a nation, and then they have a marriage covenant, in a sense, at the mountain. Mm-hmm. And I believe that's similar to what is going to happen, as I understand it, because there's the marriage feast of the Lamb and I haven't studied much about that. I've been in the Older Testament, the First Testament, most of my last 20 years. But I do know I could see these parallel things that are happening. So there is a pattern of evidence of how God acts, and he's foreshadowing, I think, what he's doing. And that's why, I'm asking for people to support this, to make a real concerted effort to go to see this. And I think there's a testimony to these, to these films that will help people. And I think as we build this body of work, it's going to be important for people to remind themselves, well, look at this is what God is doing. And I try to put a lot of what, sort of the spiritual lesson within these films. It's not just all archaeology, but there is things to be learned. And the Israelites complained so much along the way because they didn't have water, they didn't have food. And I realized that I can see God's hand in my own life in the past, but he takes me into a wilderness time. And then I start to wonder, is this the end of me? What's going to happen? And I am have to confess that I'm not as what would you say, as brave as I thought I was in some of these things. Or do I really trust that God is going to do this? And I've had to fight that because I know there's voices that are my own in my head, there's my voice, and then there's the voices of the enemy that try to discourage us as we're doing these things. And I think it's important for us to remember that. And that's why having friendships like we have here and staying focused when God calls us to do something, like he's called me to be this filmmaker. It's taken me my entire life to get to this place and to remember, okay, that's what I'm supposed to be doing. I've been given an unusual platform, and he has opened unusual doors that I realize that are not normal for people, and shown me how to do certain things. And that's why this is a gift. I think this film and the ones that we've made and the ones to come are gifts where God is saying, okay, let me show you something. And that's why this is a unique time. And I think it's preparing people who really believe to basically not be confused, because there's an awful lot of distraction and confusion that's out there in the world. And it's probably going to increase, where people's hearts, I remember reading that verse. It says people's hearts fail them, because of fear, because they're just so fearful. Well, we need to know what's what, and that God's word is true, so that we're not sucked up in that fear, and that we basically have a sure foundation.
Exactly. So let me ask you this question before we go. Again, you talked about people getting behind what you're doing. The primary ways that everyone watching this can support you beyond simply going to a theater to watch the film, or to buy and purchase a copy of the film on DVD, or tell us the different ways that people can just help you in terms of your project and everything that you're doing.
Well, one thing we've been trying to do is we have what's called Patterns of Evidence Foundation. And if you go to patternsofevidence.com, that's where you can see the trailer and buy tickets and all that. There is a place that says donate, and that helps us to make the next film. So that's a very key place to go. We also have it for people. It's like this monthly support. I've created something called the Historical Faith Society. And the Historical Faith Society is weekly videos that we just create. We've got lots of them that are come out on different subjects, such as that Mount Ebal curse that you've talked about. We're going to be having that in November. We've done the Dead Sea Scrolls. We've done a lot of things that are Bible oriented, but the focus of Patterns of Evidence Foundation and this sort of video magazine called Historical Faith Society that you become a member. It's like $16 a month. If people just sign up and said, hey, I'm going to support the work of what you're doing, it's $16 a month. And what I'm giving in return is this insider biblical information. That's another way for people to support us, or they can just, give a one-time gift to help us with the film as we're moving forward. And so I think that, those are the ways that I appreciate you asking that question. But yeah, those are the ways that people can help.
Excellent, excellent. So, and then before we go, give everyone a sneak peek. You said you've got future films planned. So you've got Journey to Mount Sinai 1 and 2. Give us a sneak peek in terms of what you've got planned for the future.
Well, we've got where did the Israelites wander for 40 years? And there's some new evidence that's coming out that is quite interesting, and we also know about these footprints that have been seen in Israel. So we're going to be dealing with the death of Moses. You know, where was he buried? Where was Aaron buried? Where did the Israelites wander? Are there any signs of their graves? And then we're going to move into the conquest and to Shechem, where Joshua came, and they had the blessings and the curse on Mount Ebal and Gerizim, those two mountains, and they yelled the curses and back and forth, and there's new evidence for that. There's actually evidence of a pillars that were there. Very controversial back that was found, because if they thought they were related to the Bible, a German scholar actually just tried to destroy one of them because he didn't like what it represented. It shows you what was going on. And so there, we're gonna go through the conquest, and then we're gonna go through Judges and Shiloh, and then we're gonna move to Saul and David, and the question of there's evidence for Saul and David too, but it's earlier, and there's a connection there, and that's been the challenge, is that traditional archaeology and its chronology have biblical time periods in a place that many think that the chronology is off. And it's not the Bible that's wrong. It's just that the scientists have shifted the history in such a way that all the evidence for the Bible is in the wrong spot. And that's why they will not, connect it to the biblical events.
Awesome. Well, you got plenty of work out ahead of you then. It's like just keep doing films until we actually get to the return of Jesus. So you've got your plenty of stuff laid out for you in the future. So, well, listen, Tim, thank you so much for jumping on with us here. I know everyone's going to find this really fascinating, and I know many of you watching this are going to want to grab tickets to go see this. And the dates, again, just remind us of the dates when the first film will be released.
Yes, it's October 17th and 18th. It's in over 800 theaters nationwide. And if you're in a rural area, we also have a new, you look for, go to our website, because you'll be able to also find, we should have information about actually having showings in churches following this, for this film. And once again, it's patternsofevidence.com, where they can see a trailer again, buy the tickets. And once again, it's only going to be shown 2 nights. And if you don't get your tickets ahead of time, if you get there and there aren't any tickets, and that's happened quite a bit with our films, then they're gone. It's like too difficult for them to scramble and find another theater. And
Sure.
So that's why it's important to, if you want to go, make the decision, take your Bible study group or your family and buy the tickets now.
All right, we'll do. Well, I'll actually, we're recording this right now. We're recording this on September 29th. And in about 6 days, I'm actually heading to Saudi Arabia with a group. So we'll be at Jebel Allah's. And then as soon as I get back, I'll have about 5 days left well, I'll grab tickets beforehand, but it'll be in about 5 days that we'll be showing the film. So I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be a good time.
Great. Well, thanks again, Joel, for your support.
Well, thank you so much, Tim, again, for all that you're doing. And I would just add this. I think I added this last time that we talked. For everyone that's watching this, the warfare that is associated with this, you think, well, it's just archaeology. Trust me, the warfare around this is very real. It's thick. And I know I've been experiencing it for the past 4 or 5 years. And I know, as Tim said, he's been walking through this for the past 20 years. There's very, very real spiritual resistance. So please remember, beyond going to the films, donating, partnering with Tim, please remember to pray for him and his family, and just for everything that he's doing, because again, prayer works. And these are the weapons that the Lord has given us. So, Well, awesome, Tim. That's all the time that we have for now. I'll look forward to chatting with you again some more between now and the next film, and we'll keep pushing this and beating these drums. So Lord bless you, and just keep up the good work.